The mightiest empire the world had ever seen, brought to its knees by a single word: defeat. Inside his palace, Emperor Augustus wandered like a broken man. He struck the walls with his fists, crying out in despair, "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions." But those legions would never return. 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead in the forests of Germania. 3 sacred eagles, the ultimate symbols of Rome's honor, were lost, and Rome swore vengeance. Stay with me. Witness how Rome tried to erase this nightmare. But one question will haunt us until the very end. Can raw power ever erase the memory of humiliation? And so we must ask, what truly happened at Teutoburg, and how did Rome never see it coming? In just a moment, you'll understand where the nightmare began. If you love epic stories of history told with drama and intensity, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next chapter. In the year 9 AD, deep within the dark, misty forests of Germania, 3 Roman legions, over 20,000 of Rome's finest, were led into a deadly trap by the very man they once called an ally. Within days, the entire force was surrounded, cut to pieces, and annihilated to the last man. Their bones were left to bleach on the damp forest floor, and the sacred eagles, the ultimate symbols of legionary honor, were seized and raised as a taunt to Rome itself. This was not just a defeat, it was a disaster, an empire's nightmare made real. Rome, the power that had conquered the Mediterranean, crushed Carthage, and brought Egypt to its knees, now lay broken before those the Romans themselves called barbarians of the northern forests. To make sense of it, imagine this. For Americans, Teutoburg was to Rome what Little Bighorn was to the United States, a shattering blow to the illusion of invincibility. When Custer's regiment was wiped out, America realized that guns and discipline alone did not guarantee victory. Rome learned that same bitter truth. Teutoburg was the punch that landed squarely on the empire's pride. Teutoburg tore apart the myth of Roman invincibility. But this was only the beginning. What followed were 4 men, 4 visions in one decision that would define what victory truly meant. The death of 20,000 soldiers did more than break the army. It sent shockwaves into the very soul of Rome. From the emperor's palace to the crowded markets, whispers spread of a truth no one could deny. Rome was powerful, but not immortal. And in that moment, the empire faced a question it could not escape. If it wanted to survive, it had to learn, and learn fast. After the nightmare of Teutoburg, history was no longer written only in blood on the battlefield, but also in the character and choices of Rome's most powerful men. First, there was Augustus, the aging emperor who had transformed Rome from a fractured republic into a mighty empire. Yet all that glory was haunted by a humiliation he could never escape. Night after night, he dreamed of the lost legions. Again and again, he muttered the same words like a curse: "Varus, give me back my legions." For Augustus, the 3 missing eagles were more than lost standards. They were wounds carved into the very soul of the empire. Then came Tiberius, his successor, cold, calculating, a skilled general in his youth. He understood war well enough. But once on the throne, his vision of victory was not parades or glory, it was stability, secure borders, a full treasury, and an unchallenged throne. For Tiberius, triumph meant order, not spectacle. In contrast to Augustus's age and Tiberius's caution, Germanicus blazed like a rising star, young, charismatic, born of noble blood, schooled in literature and the arts, but on the battlefield. He was steel discipline and Roman courage made flesh. To the soldiers, Germanicus was the very best of Rome, the commander they would follow even to death. Germanicus could win battles, but it was Tiberius who would decide what counted as victory. And on the other side stood Arminius, a German who had grown up within Rome's own ranks, who knew the Roman army as well as any Roman did. But instead of loyalty, he chose rebellion, becoming a master of asymmetric warfare. To Rome, Arminius was a traitor, To the tribes of the forest, he was freedom itself, the man who proved the empire could be brought to its knees. 4 men, 4 visions, 4 definitions of victory. Augustus demanded honor, Germanicus sought glory, Arminius fought for freedom. But in the end, it was Tiberius, the pragmatic emperor, who would decide what victory truly meant. Teutoburg was not just a defeat, it was a lesson carved in blood, etched into the collective memory of an empire. 20,000 soldiers lay dead, 3 legions erased, but out of that disaster, Rome learned to evolve, and the first lesson was simple: never let it happen again. From that moment on, Roman marches were transformed. No more endless columns stretching for miles like a parade straight into a slaughterhouse. Now they moved like a block of iron. Tight formations, shoulder to shoulder, leaving no gaps for the enemy to strike. Scouts no longer just cleared the road ahead, they fanned out in every direction. A 360-degree shield of vigilance. Every rustle in the underbrush could be a javelin waiting to fly. Surprise would never be allowed again. And when night fell, Rome no longer slept in the woods like reckless wanderers. In a single evening, tens of thousands of soldiers raised an entire fortress, deep ditches, earthen ramparts, sharpened stakes, watchtowers. Each camp became a miniature city, a declaration carved into the land. We will never be ambushed in our sleep again. What was once a forest of traps was now a fortress wall. Even the famous testudo, the tortoise formation, took on a new meaning. No longer just a symbol carved into triumphal reliefs, it became survival itself. Shields locked tight above and around, turning the unit into a living tank, an iron beast that nothing could pierce. Under storms of arrows or rocks tumbling from cliffs, the formation advanced slow, steady, unstoppable. It was not a parade maneuver. It was life or death discipline. Today, Americans have a phrase for this: forced protection, protecting the forest before chasing glory. 2,000 years ago, Rome had to lose 20,000 lives to learn that lesson, and they never forgot it. But discipline alone, would it be enough to face the storm of fury waiting in the forests of the Weser? In a world where memory still bleeds, discipline was the only armor that mattered. There are moments when war stops not because of the enemy, but because of memory, and Germanicus understood. Before his legions could march forward, they had to confront the ghost of Teutoburg. He ordered the column to halt. In the misty silence of the forest, Roman soldiers bent down to gather scattered bones, rusted fragments of armor, skulls nailed to tree trunks. 6 years after the massacre, the battlefield still stood as an unmarked grave for an empire. No enemies remained before them, only brothers left behind. Germanicus, the young commander, wept openly. He delivered a eulogy on the very soil where 20,000 had fallen. Then, with trembling hands, he placed the first handful of earth upon a mass grave. One by one, the soldiers followed, adding soil, adding stones. Within hours, a burial mound rose in the clearing, not a monument to victory, but a testimony to memory, to dignity restored. Before reclaiming the sacred eagles, Rome reclaimed something greater, the humanity of its dead. And in that somber hour, a silent promise was born that the blood spilled would not be in vain, that humiliation would be washed away, that Rome would endure. It was that promise, not sword or spear, that kept the legions marching forward. But where would that promise lead them? To immortal glory or into another abyss? To restore honor, brute strength alone was not enough. Rome needed strategy, and Germanicus brought something the enemy never expected: a two-pronged plan, an attack by land and by sea. On one front, Aulus Caecina led 4 legions through Bructeri territory. The army moved like a blade cutting into the heart of the forest, burning as it advanced, leaving behind only smoke and ash. Each village reduced to rubble was a message. Rome has returned, and this time, it will not forget. At the same time, Germanicus unveiled his surprise, a massive fleet, 1,000 ships crossing the North Sea, then driving inland up the River Ems straight into enemy territory. This was no longer the Rome of Teutoburg, naive, cumbersome, predictable. This was a new Rome, one that understood tides, one that could turn rivers into highways and the sea itself into a weapon. The Germans thought the forest was their shield, but they soon realized the rivers and the sea could be turned into swords. To the tribes, it was a nightmare made real. They had never imagined the enemy could emerge from the waves, marching hundreds of miles deep into what they thought was untouchable ground. Now they were trapped between two jaws of iron, one pressing from the land, the other from the river. Against such flexibility, raw ferocity crumbled to dust. This campaign was not just destruction, it was a declaration. Rome was not only powerful, Rome could adapt. And in war, that is the strength that endures. Dawn broke cold and pale over the river Visurgis. The war horn sounded. Roman soldiers began to cross them swimming, others in small boats. And the moment the last foot touched the opposite shore, the testudo snapped into place, shields locking into a living wall. On the flanks, Roman cavalry spread wide wings of iron guarding the advance into the forest. Then, from the shadows, an eruption of sound. Thousands of Germanic warriors burst out of the trees like a flood. They howled, hammered their shields, and charged as if to crush everything before them. For a terrifying moment, the Roman line buckled. Long spears and raw momentum nearly split the front apart. But the Germans lacked the one thing Rome had: discipline. Centurions roared orders, ranks tightened, shields closed. Short, brutal thrusts of the gladius stabbed through the case. Each strike deliberate, each step turning frenzy into a wall of corpses. Yet Arminius had one card left. Hidden cavalry waited in the woods ready to thunder down on the Roman flanks, the decisive stroke to break the legions. At his signal, the Germanic horsemen exploded from cover, certain they would carve the Romans in two. But Germanicus had been waiting. From the tree line, auxiliary cavalry charged headlong into the ambush, slamming the trap shut on the very men who thought they were springing it. Hemmed in, panicked horses crashed against one another, riders cut down with no room to maneuver. What was meant to be the killing blow became a slaughter. That was the difference. Ferocity could shake the line, but only discipline kept it from breaking. Ferocity without coordination devours itself. It was not the open battle on the Weser that nearly broke Rome, it was the swamps. When Aulus Caecina led 4 legions on their return to the Rhine, their road home forced them into the jaws of a nightmare, the long bridges. A fragile chain of wooden causeways stretched across endless marshland. To march, there was to gamble with fate. The enemy was waiting. The moment the first wagons rolled onto the planks, disaster struck. Bridges cracked and collapsed under the weight. Supply carts tipped, their wheels vanishing into black mud. Horses screamed as they were sucked beneath the mire. The Roman column stretched for miles, strangled and broken by the swamp's grip. From the ridges above, the Germans struck. Javelins hissed down, arrows thudded into shields. War cries ripped through the mist, a sound the Romans had heard before the same cries that had torn apart Varus and 3 legions 6 years earlier. And in that instant, the men felt it. History itself was repeating, Teutoburg's ghost reaching out to drag them down. Panic threatened. Soldiers whispered of omens, collapsed bridges, restless nights, strange sounds from the marsh. That evening, the camp was harassed from all sides, shadows darting at the palisades. Sleep came in snatches, and when Caecina closed his eyes, his dreams were worse. He saw Varus drenched in mud and blood, rising from the swamp, grasping his arm, trying to pull him into the abyss. At dawn, he awoke with steel in his heart. Gathering his officers, Caecina spoke plain. Varus was destroyed because he forgot what it meant to be Roman. We will not forget. Then he did the unthinkable. Instead of pressing the retreat and bleeding out, he ordered the baggage abandoned, the dead weight thrown aside. The legions tightened ranks, shields locked, and formed a massive wedge. And then, rather than waiting to be bled dry, Caecina gave the order, attack. What followed shocked the Germans. They had expected to hunt prey sinking in the mud, helpless and exhausted. Instead, out of the swamp surged a storm of iron. Roman shields slammed forward, Pila flew, and the wedge drove like a knife into the hiding places of the ambushers. Surprise shattered into chaos. German warriors, who thought they held the trap, now found themselves cornered, their cries of triumph twisting into screams of panic. Within hours, the battlefield had flipped. The hunters fled through the bog, trampled by their own, while Roman cohorts pressed relentlessly, their discipline cutting through despair like steel through flesh. The long bridges were saved not by luck, not by numbers, but by a choice to seize the initiative, to refuse despair. And that lesson endures across centuries. In an ambush, posture can matter as much as firepower. You may be dragged into the mud, but if you stay on the front foot, you can still carve your way out. High on a hilltop, deep in the wilderness of Germania, a fortress rose defiant. Its wooden palisades bristled with sharpened stakes. Its earthen ramparts crowded with warriors ready to fight until their last breath. Inside, hidden within the dark heart of that stronghold, lay the most sacred of prizes, the eagle of the 19th Legion. For the Germans, it was proof that Rome could bleed. For Rome, it was not just a lost standard, but a scar etched into the soul of the empire. The siege began like a thunderclap. For 7 relentless days, the fortress became an island in a storm. Catapults hurled stones that shattered gates and splintered towers. Flaming arrows streaked across the night, raining sparks and ash upon defenders who answered with jeers and spears. Siege towers groaned as they lurched forward through mud and smoke, while Roman ladders clattered against the walls. Every inch was bought with pain. Soldiers clawed their way up, only to be hurled back down, bodies impaled on jagged stakes. Skulls crushed beneath boulders dropped from above. The air reeked of pitch, blood, and burning wood. And yet, amid that chaos, a nameless soldier would step into history. His name, Marcus Ventidius, never carved on marble, never sung in the Senate. Yet in that moment, he became the spark of redemption. When the final wall splintered and collapsed, Ventidius was the first through the breach. Smoke and fire swallowed him whole as he vanished into the fortress interior. For a heartbeat, no one knew if he had lived. Then, through the flames, he emerged, his face blackened with soot, his lungs choked with ash, but his hands clutching the eagle of the 19th. The sight was electric. A wave of sound erupted from thousands of Roman throats, a roar that shook the forest as if the legions themselves were reborn. Hardened veterans, men who had seen horror without flinching, wept openly. For they knew this was more than a standard of bronze and gold, it was the resurrection of honor. Germanicus himself took the eagle into his arms. He kissed the smoke-scorched metal, lifted it high for all to see, and proclaimed, "Today, the spirits of our fallen brothers may finally rest." By the end of his campaigns, 2 of the 3 lost eagles had been reclaimed. The last would not return until decades later, under Emperor Claudius. But in that moment, one wound of Teutoburg had been healed. The eagle had returned. Rome had proven it could recover what was lost. And yet, beneath the cheers and the tears, one truth remained unshaken. The thirst for vengeance was far from quenched. Edis Diviso, a vast plain, stretched along the banks of the Weser River. No forest to conceal an ambush, no swamps to swallow men whole. Today, the ground itself favored Rome. 30,000 legionaries stood in perfect formation, shields locked, spears bristling. The empire brought its war machine into the open field, ready for a decisive clash. Across from them stood Arminius, the man who had once delivered Rome its nightmare at Teutoburg. This time, he had no surprise, no hidden trap, but he did have something else: the loyalty and fury of tens of thousands of tribal warriors. With the beat of drums and the roar of war cries, Arminius gathered his fiercest fighters, forging them into a single spearhead of flesh and bone, aimed straight at the Roman center. The collision shook the earth itself. Shield slammed against shield, spears pierced armor, and the clash of iron mixed with the primal screams of men fighting for survival. For a moment, just a moment, the Roman line wavered. Arminius' spear point seemed ready to crack the wall of steel. And then it came down to a single life. One nameless Roman guard threw himself in front of Arminius' massive spear. His death bought the heartbeat of time needed for the second line to lock shields. The wall sealed shut. The spear point broke. Arminius pressed forward, towering above the melee, his giant spear crowned with eagle feathers swinging high, visible to all. But with every step, he sank deeper into a sea of Roman shields. The legions tightened the ring, short gladii stabbing with brutal precision. Ferocity had no place against discipline that refused to yield. Then, like a wave collapsing on itself, the Germanic lines broke. A fighting retreat dissolved into a rout. A rout collapsed into chaos. And in that moment, the Roman cavalry surged out an iron stamp that ended the sentence. No escape, no order, only blood and dust. Wounded but alive, Arminius escaped with a handful of followers into the forest shadows. But before disappearing, he turned back one last time only to see the plain he had hoped to make into Rome's grave, transformed into a slaughterhouse for his own people. It wasn't spears, it wasn't ambushes in the forest. It was nature itself that brought Rome to its knees. After weeks of relentless campaigning, Germanicus' fleet set sail across the North Sea. The sky turned dark, the wind howled, and without warning, a furious storm descended. Thunder split the heavens. Waves rose like walls of water. Warships rolled and shattered, masts snapped, and vessels were swallowed whole by the whirlpool of the sea. Soldiers who had survived a dozen battles vanished in an instant, consumed by the ocean. Some would later say that in one night, Rome lost more men than in any single battle against Arminius. The sea had done what the German tribes could not. But while the waves drowned legions, in Rome another storm was rising: politics and suspicion. News of victory and disaster crashed into the capital at the same time. The people hailed Germanicus as a savior, the man who avenged Teutoburg, reclaimed two of the lost eagles, and restored Roman honor. Yet in the cold marble corridors of the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Tiberius saw no glory, he saw the cost. Every road into Germania was paid for in blood. Every burned village, every swamp the legions forced their way through, was a bottomless pit consuming treasure, grain, and lives. Tiberius understood one truth: glory fades, but cost endures. The emperor chose pragmatism. Let the tribes tear each other apart. Let their ancient feuds do what Roman legions could not. It wasn't weakness, it was the cold calculation of a ruler. Germania, in his eyes, was not worth turning into a province. Not because Rome couldn't take it, but because Rome didn't need it. And so came the irony. Rome's legions had won on the battlefield, but lost in the council chamber. Germanicus, young, brilliant, adored by his men, wanted to press on, to crush Arminius once and for all. But Tiberius reined him in. He wanted a stable empire, not a rising hero who might challenge the throne. From this moment echoes a question that haunts every empire, every superpower. Where is the limit of victory? When does a military triumph stop being glory and start becoming a burden? Rome had restored its honor. It had proven its strength. But it had also learned a brutal truth. There are lands blood cannot hold, and there are victories so costly that no one is left to celebrate them. The empire had washed away the shame of Teutoburg. Once again, the golden eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, rose beneath the Roman sky. The legions marched through the streets in triumph, banners held high, crowds roaring with jubilation, and the Senate carved its victory into marble as if it were eternal. For a moment, it seemed as though Rome had turned disaster into glory. But peel back the curtain of triumph, and a different picture emerges. Behind every blast of the trumpet were German villages burning in the night, their walls collapsing in showers of sparks, their people screaming before being silenced forever. Behind every roar of applause were lines of chained captives, men, women, and children driven like cattle through the dust of the road, their eyes hollow with despair, destined for the slave markets of Rome. Behind every eagle raised in celebration was blood soaking the frozen earth, the lifeblood of prisoners executed without mercy, their bodies left to rot beneath the blackened trees of the forest. Yes, Rome had won undeniably. But what, truly, was the price of that victory? They claimed they were bringing order. But what kind of order is it when children vanish from their homes? When sacred temples are profaned? When fertile fields that once fed villages are plowed into wastelands of blood and ashes? The historian Tacitus, a witness to that age, refused to be blinded by the glitter of triumph. In his account of Rome's conquest of distant Britannia, he borrowed the words of the Caledonian chieftain Calgacus, words that cut deeper than any sword. They make a desert and call it peace. Those words, those spoken of the misty isles in the north, echo across Germania, across every campaign where Rome left nothing behind but charred ruins and silence. This was not only a judgment on Rome, it was a question aimed at every empire, every power that dares to define peace in its own image. It was not a curse, but a mirror held up to the proud conqueror, reflecting the truth that some victories do not smell of incense and glory, but of smoke, ashes, and the iron stench of blood. Rome had reclaimed its eagles, but in doing so, had it lost something greater? Had it lost the very soul that once claimed to bring civilization to the world? After all the blood, the marches, and the blare of triumphal trumpets, Germania never became a Roman province. The Rhine became the border, and for centuries it held, like a scar across Europe, reminding both sides of the price of conquest for Americans. It's as if the frontier line had hardened into a river, the boundary holding not just armies apart, but two ideas of civilization. Arminius, or Hermann, in the memory of the Germans, rose from flesh and blood into a symbol of freedom, of resistance against the mighty. Germanicus, the triumphant hero of Rome, was celebrated, and then lost in tragedy, leaving behind a story half light, half shadow. Rome had taken its revenge. It had restored its honor. It had brought the eagles home. But no act of vengeance could ever bring back the lives lost. The villages turned to ash, or the purity of the empire's own soul. Power can be vast, but even Rome's power had limits. And wisdom, sometimes, is not about pushing farther, but knowing when to stop before being pulled into the spiral of self-destruction. And what about us? Between victory and self-destruction, where do we draw the line? If this story has struck something in you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Where do you draw the line? Press on for glory, or stop before self-destruction?